Wow, I never thought that I would be so relieved to make a video like this on such a generic topic. So here's the thing, if you're already familiar with the current direction and purpose of this channel, you know I'm trying to create essentially a comprehensive jazz guitar education course that really tries to unfold in a logical order or progression and is formatted over a long series of videos. I really put a lot of thought into what I feel would be an optimal sequencing of topics and information in a way that would really be conducive for creating smooth and logical progress. Just like if you were following along with the instruction booklet for a set of Legos. The next chapter of this journey specifically explores the topic of working individual bits and pieces of musical material now into the body or hands. And we'll first focus on linear single-note melodic ideas, and then we'll go to chordal ideas afterwards. This subject in particular can be very exciting, or at least I think so, but before I can really get to any of the exciting stuff, for the sake of keeping a logical order or progression, I need to first cover my bases and establish important musical foundational knowledge just for the consideration of all viewers who may be at different levels of skills and knowledge and experience. For all practicality purposes, the thing that really matters for your guitar playing that relates to the topic of this video is just to know the 5 different fingerings or positions that are commonly labeled as the CAGED fingerings for the major scale. You want to confidently have all of these shapes memorized. You want to be able to understand what they are harmonically and theoretically and understand how to apply them. And you want to know how the 5 different positions connect to each other and all relate to the same key diatonically for all keys. I'm certain that for a lot of viewers, all of that stuff should already be pretty basic and familiar. So if you feel this way, you don't really need to watch the rest of this video because what I just said is what really matters, but I am still going to be making some different points that you may not have heard before that are related to the CAGED system and why I feel there's a real significance when it comes to systemizing these shapes, and how there are a lot of potential benefits to be had from utilizing this system for massive jazz guitar improvement. And if you really do the things that I'm about to get into over the next course of videos, that is something that I could promise you. And you know, if you're watching this video, I would say that you're probably interested in something like that, right?
Now, would that be something you might be interested in?
Definitely. Boom, I'm a matchmaker.
So we're gonna get right into it, but real quick, if you're new to the channel, welcome. My name is Derek Plavin, and I already basically explained the nature of this channel. So, you know, if you like what I'm saying, make sure to check out the rest of my videos. And other than that, I'm available for private lessons as well and have a lot of accompanying PDFs that go along with a lot of the videos on this channel. And information for all this stuff can be found on my website as well as my Patreon. And also, if you're enjoying the video, please give it a like and subscribe as well. So, really quickly, I decided to split this little preliminary topic up into 2 parts just so the video wouldn't get too long. So, when I was mentioning before how I wanted to make some different and perhaps lesser known and understood points about the CAGED system that you may find helpful, I'm definitely going to be still doing some of that more towards the end of this video, but the rest of that stuff will be more so in part 2. And a lot of the stuff in this video will still probably be pretty basic and familiar stuff for you, but just make sure to stick around to the end to make sure you don't miss anything, alright? And as always, thanks for watching. Now, when it comes to the basics of the CAGED system, this is something that you could find endless videos on that are a dime a dozen, so I don't think I really need to make another cookie cutter video on the topic, but what I want to try and do here, like I said before, is try to point out some things that you may not have considered that try to explain why exactly the CAGED system may actually be important. So, first of all, it's pretty much common knowledge that the CAGED system yields, like I mentioned before, these 5 different positions for the major scale that all connect and overlap with each other. And when I first started playing the guitar and learned the major scale, these were the shapes that I was originally taught, and they were fine, but I had not yet developed an awareness as to why it may be important to label these shapes as being part of this system. And just to really clarify what I mean by that, I didn't really see the point yet as to why we would deliberately want to assign a label to these 5 fingerings that basically define them as being part of this sort of system. And for a while, whenever it came to things like all the various fundamental shapes and fingerings for things on the guitar that we all learn and could say are coming out of this CAGED system, I kind of just saw all that stuff as being simply just the inevitabilities of how things laid on the instrument in accordance with the standard tuning of the guitar. So whenever I would come across any sort of mention of this CAGED system, I didn't really understand what the big deal was about it, because everything that seemed to be part of the system was just stuff that you needed to know to play guitar either way. So, not that it really needs a reason, but I think at least partially the reason why I could have thought like this was because not long after I had learned these 5 original shapes, I started to learn about things like modes on the guitar, and for a while, whenever it came to things like breaking up major scales across the fretboard in all keys on the guitar, I would typically see it as more of a 7-position system where you had one shape that started on each degree of the major scale with your index finger. Usually this 7-position system would be taught in a way where you had mostly these 3-note per string shapes, although not necessarily 3 notes on every string in every shape, but you could do it like that if you wanted. And like I said before, the first note on the low E string, or the first note of the range of the position, would always be with your index finger. But to me, I always saw some of these 3-note per string shapes from the 7-position system as essentially being the same as some of the CAGED fingerings that I already knew, just with some slight variation in the fingerings perhaps. So just to show you what I mean, and I'm going to do everything in the key of D major today, I would say that a shape like this, for example, which you may find in the 7-position system, you know, and some people may call this E Dorian, but it's still just D major. I see that as the same thing as this. Doesn't matter if I'm playing that note there and there, you know. To me, they're basically the same shape, and I didn't really see the need to catalog them differently. And therefore, it just worked out where with the 7-position system, 5 of the 7 shapes were the same thing as the 5 CAGED fingerings anyway, and we just had 2 extra shapes. Because of this, I kind of saw the systemization of fingerings for the major scale as kind of arbitrary, and it didn't really matter to me how exactly I broke up the scale across the fretboard, because it was all just connected anyway and you just needed to know it. You could also break up the major scale across the fretboard into 4-note per string shapes as well if you choose, for all the Alan Holdsworth fans out there. It was only much later in my development where I started to recognize the true benefits to primarily utilizing the 5-position system that you get with the CAGED system fingerings over any other sort of system. And when we compare the 7-position system to this, we basically end up with 2 extra shapes that can essentially be disregarded for the most part. And just so you're aware, the 2 extra shapes that I'm talking about, which you may see as very common shapes, would be what a lot of people would consider to be the Ionian shape. So for the key of D major, like D Ionian, so this classic 3-note per string shape. And then the Lydian shape, which the key of D major would be like G Lydian. At least one of the shapes. Right? So basically, those 2 shapes are not really part of this system. So why is it really better then to use a 5-position system? When we consider the specifics, it becomes apparent. We could start with the obvious fact that when, at least compared to the 7-position system, 5 positions is just less information for us to concern ourselves with, and therefore can create more efficiency when it comes to having a clear and systematic way that you can commit to for working out various kinds of material on the guitar. In my opinion, there really isn't anything too significant that is lost by omitting and not utilizing the 2 extra shapes that you get with the 7-position system. In fact, I would say that the most legitimate argument there is for continuing to use these 2, usually 3-note per string shapes would be more technique or phrasing related. Like, if you're mainly more of a legato type of a player, you may prefer these shapes for how you might go about articulating them. But other than that, I don't really find these 2 shapes particularly necessary anymore, at least for what I'm really trying to do on the guitar as of now. Now, while having less information to deal with is clearly beneficial, this alone still doesn't really explain to me what's so special about these 5 fingerings. So, moving along, the next thing to notice is how these 5 CAGED fingerings of the major scale are all directly related to the 5 fingerings or position of our old friend, the minor/major pentatonic scale. And being that pentatonic scales only have 5 notes, we don't have as many options really for how we could break it up across the fretboard. So the inevitable 5 positions that we all learn are pretty standardized and accepted as being conventionally typical in accordance with the standard tuning of the guitar. In addition, these shapes establish a very logical foundation for how we could go about breaking up any given scale or key across the fretboard into relatively even positions that are pretty comfortable to play. While there are very legitimate benefits to seeing pentatonic scales as their own individual thing, we can also understand them as sort of being these 5-note shells or fragments of a more complete 7-note diatonic scale. And by simply adding in these 2 missing notes and filling out a more complete major scale, these pentatonic scale fingerings automatically become the 5 CAGED scale fingerings. For this reason, we can also really kind of label these pentatonic shapes or positions as the CAGED fingerings for the pentatonic scale. This connection between the 5 shapes of the pentatonic scale and the 5 CAGED fingerings of the major scale should establish some sort of significance now as to why the 5 CAGED fingerings should perhaps take some sort of priority over any other possible shapes of the major scale. Now, here's where it starts to get interesting. From a harmonic point of view, even though we should understand that any 5 of these CAGED fingerings of the major scale can technically be seen as any 7 of the modes of the major scale, and that's really determined by the context of the musical scenario that you're in, if we look at these 5 fingerings uniformly as being the same basic major scale or Ionian mode, and then go ahead and pick out where the root notes would be within each of the 5 positions, we can discover some really interesting things. First, it shows us why we will technically label these 5 shapes respectively as the C, A, G, E, and D shapes. When we relate to the roots in each position and notice where we could find the basic major chord or triad that is related to that particular root within the position, we'll see that the shapes that emerge are related to the same basic open position chord shape that we all know that has the same root name as the name of that scale position. So, just to show you an example of what I mean, say we look at this position for a D major scale that we can technically label as being the C shape for a D major scale, and that would start on the 2nd fret, would be this shape. Okay? And some people may think of this scale shape as the F sharp Phrygian scale shape, but it's all the same thing. It's diatonic to D major. So if we find the root note D, and then within that position, pick out where the notes of a D major triad or chord would be, that shape that emerges is the same exact shape as the basic C major chord, okay? So that's why we call this the C shape. So if I go up to the next shape, that would be the A shape in the key of D major, This starts on the 5th fret here. Some people may think of this as A mixolydian, same thing. So again, we find the root note D in the same place, but within the notes of this position, if we pick out a D major triad, we don't play this note in the chord shape, but that note is up there. We get this chord shape, which most of us obviously should know is the same shape as this basic A major chord. So that's why that one is the A shape, all right? So now this reveals to us the next layer of significance with the CAGED system, because it shows us the logical connection between the fundamental shapes for scales, chords, and arpeggios on the guitar, and how they all essentially overlap and connect with each other. Essentially, the guitar has 5 primary scale shapes or positions and 5 primary chord/arpeggio shapes that things could be based off of, and both of these, groups of 5 shapes are directly related to each other. And not to be redundant, but when it comes to the basic chords, we really do only have 5 primary shapes, because if you think about the fact that, way back in episode 2, I said that there's 12 basic beginner guitar chords that everyone needs to learn. But if you take a look at those 12 chords, you can really boil them down to only 5 primary shapes, because first of all, of those 12, 9 of them consist of 3 E chords, 3 A's, and 3 D's. So for each of those, triplets, the 3 chords in each of those are based off of the same family of shapes. So we really only have one main shape for all of those. So that leaves us with 3 shapes there. And then of the 3 chords that remain, the F major chord, that's not an original shape, because if we look at basically, an E major shape, and then we turned it into a bar, we played F major, well, the top 4 strings is your F major. So that shape is based off of the same shape as the E shape. So we're left with the G major and the C major, and that gives us our 5 primary chord shapes. So everything that I've already said is sort of like preliminary knowledge to what I'm going to say going forward, and that's probably why a lot of this sounds really basic so far. So thanks for sticking with me. Now we're going to get into the stuff that I think really matters. From understanding the relationship between the 5 primary scale shapes and the 5 primary chord/arpeggio shapes, I eventually realized that for any given musical idea, which can be something fundamental like a chord or triad or scale or arpeggio, like what we've been talking about, but also something that is genuinely musical like a phrase or a lick or a motif or something, there are typically 5 main forms for whatever the musical thing may be. And these 5 forms are consistently related to 5 different ways that we could basically view the fretboard in relationship to a root, and that root note would relate to, whatever the basic tonality is of whatever the musical idea is. So, here's what the 5 primary ways are for how we can basically perceive or interpret the fretboard at any given moment that would relate to a particular root note of a given tonality. And just an FYI, there isn't any order of significance to how I'm listing these forms. I'm just going in the same order that would inevitably spell out the word CAGED with the labeling of these forms, all right? So the first one would be, I guess we could say, the C way, or the C form of seeing things. And again, we're in the key of D major. So when you're dealing with the C form, that's when you have the root note on the A string, and generally speaking, mostly everything else is going to be laying behind the root note, or frets that come before it. And we looked at this scale fingering before on the 2nd fret, because that's the C form. That's what you have. Everything else is basically laying in front of it over there, or basically on the same fret, okay? So that's what you need to know about the C form. Okay, now the next one would be the A form, and that would basically be the opposite. So that's when you have the root note again on the A string, but generally speaking, now you're looking at things that generally lay in front of the root note. And with this scale form that we also looked at before, we do have some notes in this position that are on the 4th fret there, but for the most part, everything lays in front, and that's okay. You're just kind of using this as a general blueprint and way of sort of breaking up positions on the fretboard, okay? So A would be root note on the A string, things lay in front of it, okay? Next, we have the G form or G way of saying things and seeing things. And that's when you have the root note on the E string, but you're looking at things, again, behind the root note, just like we have with the C form. Okay, so that would be this shape, which you may see is like a B Aeolian, but it's this relative minor of D major, right? And again, the root note is here, everything lays behind it. And then after that, we have the E form, which you can probably predict what this would be next. That's, again, when we have the root note on the E string, and now things are generally laying in front of it, okay? So that would be like this form. Technically, the first note in the range of this position would be the major 7th. So you may see that as like C sharp Locrian or D major. It's all the same, right? So that would be the E form. And then finally, we have the D form, and that would be when we have the root note on the D string and basically things laying in front, okay? Now, this starts all the way up here, so we have a lot of notes that come before it. This is like your E Dorian, but generally things are laying in front. And in case you're wondering, well, is there a way of seeing things where you have the root note on the D string, but things are laying behind it? That's the same thing as the E form, basically, because when you have this E form over here, within this shape, you have that D major triad there. The other one is basically literally the D major chord that our basic D chord is based off of, because we have this open D, and look, all these notes lay in front of it, okay? So that's the D form. So basically, with these 5 forms, this makes everything seem so much more simpler when it comes to, you know, having a confident understanding of the different possible ways of how you can view certain things on the guitar. So by having an understanding of this, it can make things a lot more efficient for you when it comes to, you know, working through material and whatnot, all right? So I think that this would be a good place to put a cork in the discussion for now, because I don't want to overload you with information like I usually do. So in the next episode,
hope you're ready for the next episode. Hey.
I'm just going to pick up right where I left off here, and I'm going to get into some more specific points that are still dealing with the CAGED system, but start to show you really what it has to offer you if you really choose to take this stuff seriously, alright? So it's very interesting stuff. So if anyone has any questions or anything they want to say, just put it in the comments. I'm here to help. And if you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you gave it a like and consider becoming a subscriber as well as a contributor to Patreon, where you get all the PDFs on this channel for only $5 a month. And if you think anyone else would enjoy the content, please share it with them. And I will see you guys in episode 63.
Swinging and playing the blues. That's what we about.
I try to help you.